If you were the right age in the 80s or 90s, there's a very good chance you've read Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, or its sequels, More Scary Stories and Scary Stories 3 by Alvin Schwartz. These tiny children's books, retelling a variety of spooky tales collected from folklore, have a reputation of scaring the bejesus out of a lot of kids and turning plenty of people into lifelong horror fans. It wasn't just the stories, though, that creeped people out, but the delightfully macabre illustrations by Stephen Gammell. Unless you happen to read the HarperCollins reissues from around 2011, when the Gammell art was replaced by works by one Brett Hellquist. Of course, fans of the series were displeased, and the Gammell art has been restored to later editions. And to be fair, the Hellquist art isn't bad, and we should probably be sympathetic to the fact that his job, replacing art that has become iconic, was pretty much an impossible one. Even still, it's for the best that you'll now find the books as they were meant to be seen with the disturbing Gammell art intact. But I'm guessing you probably already know all of that. You probably also know that back in 2019, Guillermo del Toro produced a film adaptation of the series, also called Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Now that a couple years have passed, it seems like it's been long enough that we can attempt a fair comparison between the books and the film. Let's start with the experience of rereading these books as an adult, because that's exactly what I did in preparation for this discussion. I both wanted to refresh my memory of the stories and to see how well they hold up. And honestly, it's kind of a mixed bag. Of course, these are meant to be children's books, so we wouldn't really expect them to pack much of a horrific oomph for an adult audience. That goes double for someone as immersed in horror as I am. The fact of the matter is, if you come to these books as an adult, you'd probably find they wouldn't quite live up to their reputation for being horrifying. If you approach them as a child, though, it's easy to see why they do have that reputation for being frighteningly excellent. The illustrations stand out first. It's pretty hard for a simple illustration to actually scare anyone, but if we're completely honest, these are the caliber of illustrations we might expect to see alongside real horror stories for adult audiences in professional literary magazines or anthologies. The stories themselves, though written for children, are actually delightfully creepy. However, because they are written for children, the simplistic narrative voice will probably keep adults from really enjoying them if it's your first time reading through. On the other hand, if you do remember them from your youth, I imagine the nostalgia factor makes the reread a wonderful experience for just about anyone. And the stories cover quite a variety. Yes, there's a lot of repetition between the three books, and some of the same gags would get a little tiresome if you read through everything in a single sitting. But in addition to the repeated themes, there's also quite a range of different ideas in many of these stories. The thing that most of the stories have in common, though, is that they're written with oral narration in mind. The books often instruct the reader on how to tell the story as if you're reciting the tales around a campfire. Often the stories end with an instruction to startle somebody sitting next to you. Effective campfire story technique, of course, but at the cost of leaving some of the stories seemingly unfinished and open-ended. And that brings us to the movie, because the biggest difference overall between the written stories and the stories seen on film is that the movie provides a bit more background and a bit more of a conclusion to many of the stories, making it more of a traditional narrative structure rather than a set of campfire ghost stories. The other big difference is that the film isn't just an anthology film of several distinct stories. True, it does feature several of the stories from the books, but it also adapts one of the scary stories into a wraparound tale to weave the entire movie together into a coherent whole. In all, the movie features 6 stories collected from all of the Scary Stories books: The Haunted House, Herald, The Big Toe, The Red Spot, The Dream, and one called The Jangly Man, which is a mashup of the books What Do You Come For and Me Tai Doti Walker. Let's briefly examine how each of the stories compares from book to film. I warn you now, there be spoilers ahead. So if you haven't read the books or seen the movie, and you're the type of person who likes to avoid spoilers, you might just want to click on my name down below and check out one of my many other wonderful videos instead. For the rest of you though, let's get right to it. The Haunted House. This story appears in the first volume of the series and is actually one of the longer ones, coming in at 3 pages plus a 4th full-page illustration. It tells the story of a preacher who visits a haunted house and discovers the ghost of a young woman murdered for her money. Ultimately, he's able to bring the murderer to justice and put the spirit to rest. This makes it one of the more complete stories in the books, with a clearly defined beginning, middle, and end. It's also one of the most changed stories between the book and the movie. In the film version, there is no preacher reading his Bible in the haunted house at all. Instead, the illustration of the ghostly woman from the book was adapted to film and given an entirely new identity as Sarah Bellows, the ghostly author of the book of scary stories around which the movie's narrative is based. This provides the wraparound narrative for the entire film and gives us a story that intersects all of the other tales to varying degrees, particularly the Jangly Man, which we'll get to in a moment. However, because the characters are changed out and the story is adapted in such a way that all the other tales fit inside it, it actually loses almost everything from the original story. Rather than just giving us a delightfully creepy tale of a preacher and a ghost, the filmmakers took the opportunity to build a larger cast of characters and to dip their toes into the waters of social commentary in a way that the books simply didn't. Whether they were successful in that social commentary or not, I'm not really going to get into. Personally, I found it not terribly intrusive, but also not terribly successful. Your mileage may vary. In some ways, it's the most complete story in the film, which ought to put it at the head of the pack, but if we want to judge it as an adaptation of its source material rather than on its own merits, it's probably the biggest flop of them all. The next story is Herald. This one comes from the 3rd volume of the book series and is another of the longer stories in the collection, coming in at about the same length as The Haunted House. It's the story of some teenagers who use their scarecrow as a bit of a punching bag. In the book, the story ends when Herald the Scarecrow comes to life and skins one of the boys alive. The movie follows roughly the same story, though featuring characters established in the wraparound story. However, the ending, while similarly unfortunate for Herald's victim, is toned down a bit. In the movie, rather than skinning the boy alive, Herald stabs him with a pitchfork and turns him into a scarecrow himself, presumably to be subject to the same abuses he and his friends subjected Herald the Scarecrow to. In some ways, I actually like the movie's ending better. The fact that the town bully gets turned into the very object he and his friends subjected to abuses in the past adds a certain delightful irony to the narrative that's lacking in the book. However, I have to admit, I kinda wanted to see the kid get skinned alive as happened in the book. I think the real reason for the change is that the filmmakers wanted to still appeal to a young audience. And while they're certainly willing to scare the kiddos, I don't think they wanted to actually show us something quite as grisly as a scarecrow stretching out pieces of human flesh to dry in the sun. Maybe that was an artistic decision, or maybe they were just trying to keep their PG-13 rating. Either way, the movie exchanges a grisly visual for an ironic scene. The Big Toe. This odd little story has the distinction of being the very first story in the very first book of the series, so it's unsurprising that it also made an appearance in the film. The story is about 2 pages long and tells the tale of a boy who finds a human toe out in the garden and brings it home. His mother, for some inexplicable reason, puts it into the soup. Well, sure enough, the ghost it belongs to comes looking for the toe, only to discover it's actually in the child's belly by this point. Interestingly, the story is actually presented with 2 different endings. In the first, the ghost comes to the house calling, "Where's my toe?" And then the book tells whoever is reciting the story to jump at the nearest listener and shout, "You've got it!" In the alternate ending, the boy ends up having a conversation with the creature, though it ultimately also ends with a similar jump scare at the very end. In case anyone's wondering, the first ending is much better and far more consistent with the way the rest of the story is written. The movie gives a fairly faithful adaptation. The cannibalism in the tale is rendered inadvertent instead of deliberate, which probably makes more sense anyway, although I think one of the most wonderful things about the Scary Stories books is that they're children's books with cannibals as protagonists for no apparent reason at all. In any case, the movie still features a ghostly creature coming for the boy who ate, in this case accidentally, the big toe. And both stories seem to end poorly for our leading lad. The book leaves it a bit open-ended with its jump scare, though it certainly suggests that nothing good happens. The movie, on the other hand, is a bit more explicit, treating us to a scene in which the boy is dragged from under his bed into some kind of nether realm, leaving only claw marks across the floor as evidence of whatever happened. It's a bizarre story either way, but I'm actually happy with the way the film handled this one. For The Red Spot, we return to Volume 3 of the books and one of the shortest tales in the entire series, coming in at only about half a page in length. Plus, as usual, a full-page illustration. And honestly, the illustration pretty much tells the story as well as the story itself does. The illustration shows a picture of a girl with spiders bursting from her own face. The story? Quite simply, a girl gets bitten by a spider, and the resulting red spot on her face grows bigger and uglier until ultimately a bunch of spiders erupt from it. What about the movie? Well, the filmmakers didn't disappoint. The movie is pretty much entirely faithful to the source material. Because it features characters common to the overarching story in the film, it takes a little more time treating us to how the girl reacts to the unsightly spider bite, but the final payoff is exactly the same. The movie adds a follow-up that the character ends up in an insane asylum, absent from the original story, but it does seem to fit quite well. If y'all know anything about me, you know I'm fond of spiders. Both the real animals, which are usually harmless little friends, and the horror stories that tap into the sense of arachnophobia that almost everyone except me seems to experience. I've actually written stories not entirely unlike The Red Spot myself, so you just know this has to be one of my favorites. It feels like a bit of a throwaway in the movie, but they handled it well enough that it ended up being a highlight for me anyway. And if any of you are interested in my own spider-laden horror stories, make sure you subscribe to this channel and ring the notification bell so you won't miss out on any announcements whenever they're available in print. In fact, even if you're not interested in my spider stories, subscribe anyway so you don't miss out on all the other horrific goodness I have in store for my viewers. The Dream is a 2-page story also from Volume 3 in the books. It tells us of someone about to visit a new place, but she has a nightmare and so changes her plans and goes somewhere else instead, only to discover that the real nightmare, a monstrous pale lady, inhabits the new place instead of the one that she was scared off from. The story ends with the girl fleeing this nightmare. The movie, of course featuring different characters to maintain continuity with the other stories, is similar and does still feature the pale lady, rendered on screen directly from the book's illustration, but the film actually expands on the story quite a bit, treating us to scenes of the pale lady stalking the character through the hallways, and ultimately grabbing him and basically absorbing him into herself in a weird sort of way. An argument could be made that this provides more of a prolonged scare and more of a horrifying ending. But an argument could equally be made that the stalking through the hallways isn't as effective as the pale lady's sudden appearance in the written story. Ultimately, I have to admit this isn't one of my favorite tales in either the book or the movie. I think the adaptation, though it changed some things, was fine, but neither version ever really quite did it for me, personally. The Jangly Man. This is the final story from the film, and interestingly, it doesn't have a direct counterpart in the source material. However, we should consider 2 stories from the books as clear inspirations for the Jangly Man character. The first is a 1-page entry in the first book called What Do You Come For? It features a woman sitting by a fireplace. Then, one by one, body parts start tumbling down the chimney. eventually assembling themselves into a living corpse, described in the story as, quote, a great gangling man. When the woman asks the title question, "What do you come for?" he replies, and the storyteller is meant to shout at the listeners, "I come for you!" The very next story in the book is called Me Tai Doti Walker. It also features a ghostly character coming from a chimney, but in this case it's just a severed head, which utters the nonsense phrase from the title. Ultimately, this monster scares the main character's dog to death. The movie draws from both of these stories to create the Jangly Man. He does come from a chimney and does utter that phrase when he's still just a head before assembling himself into a full living corpse. But his description is more of a mashup of the two. His jangly characteristics are clearly drawn from the former story, and his catchphrase from the latter. Narratively, he ends up pursuing the film's heroes for a bit, but his story comes to an end as the wraparound story reaches its climax, so the film's version of the story ultimately doesn't bear much resemblance at all to the source material. Putting it all together, I think the movie is actually a reasonably strong adaptation of the books, as long as we give it some space to be its own thing. A movie can't actually adapt the books directly because the books are full of campfire tales that just don't have the kind of narrative structure that would work on screen. But the film does make reference to a few of the classic stories, even though for some reason it completely omits the entirety of the second volume. I'm not quite sure why. One of the most important things is the way the filmmakers brought the Gammell illustrations to life. Honestly, I think they did an admirable job. Even though someone else actually directed the movie, the monsters definitely bear some of Guillermo del Toro's fingerprints, and that's a good thing. Comparing the film's monsters to the book's illustrations, we see that many of them actually look like they sort of stepped right from the page and gained physical reality. And that's both a good thing and a bad thing. It's good in that it's faithful to the source material and gives the fans a lot to like. However, where it doesn't quite work is that Gammell's illustrations in the books have an almost abstract, sort of otherworldly feeling to them, and trying to put that kind of uncanny sensibility into something that actually interacts with live characters ends up losing some of the creepiness of the original illustrations. Ultimately, I think the movie is a bit of good fan service for those who grew up reading the books, and might be a decent gateway into the horror genre for younger viewers who aren't quite ready for the heavy-hitting stuff I normally like to watch. But as I bring this book versus film discussion to a close, I can't help but remark that both the books and the movie neglected to include that most terrifying story of all. The story of what happens to people who don't subscribe to the Phobophile channel. So make sure you don't fall victim to that curse, and until next time, take care and stay scared.